Yeah. The issue is well posed by Jimena Alarcon in the title of her piece on Brazil. Are we watching our neighbours or watching for our neighbours? She notes that, to quote, during the weekend, this Twitter video, which is the picture you can see here, of a great-grandfather meeting a great-granddaughter meeting a 75-year-old great-grandpa for the first time. And this kind of went viral, collected a lot of positive and emotional comments, reflecting, on the one hand, the importance of family bonds, the lost shared face-to-face due to the lockdown, but also a lot of negative comments, reflecting on the unnecessary risk of having them embraced in this way. To quote, there is a high level of public surveillance. It seems that in these strange times, all must be watched and everything is being carefully watched. Relaxed neighbours who use their face masks wrong, our hands, where do we put them without touching our faces, the distances we keep in the streets, our ID numbers to see whether they match with our turn to go out. So how did these issues develop in terms of my own field site of Cuan, which by the way is a pseudonym, but it's a town on the east coast of Ireland. Now, what happened was some 2,300 out of a town of a population of about 10,000 very quickly joined a new Facebook group called Cuan Against COVID-19. And much of what they shared was an attempt to achieve consensus around what it means to be a good citizen, mostly by extending the state's authority and taking on this role of surveillance and adjudication. There were constant memes and statements supporting the regulations regarding social distancing, as you can see in these memes here, and staying at home. Now, in my last research project, which was called Why We Post, we developed a theory of the meme. And we called the meme the moral police of the internet, because they are a very quick and easy way to express a person's values, moral judgments, and often to create normative consensus. Here, another two examples. And they're quite characteristic of meme culture. They're based largely on humor, and they even provide continuity with the last paper, because you've got a cat and a dog. Now, one of the most common textual interventions on the Facebook forum was to draw attention to non-compliance. For example, one post read, "Don't mean to be a spoilsport, but do parents realise that their teens are socialising in big groups, walking around the town, hanging around on the beaches, and there is absolutely no social distancing going on?" Oops, sorry. Okay. Please, parents, be aware of what your daughters are doing, and they're coming home to you and the rest of the family. It's hard for them, I know, but we've all been so good. Let's not throw that away with a new wave of COVID-19. Such postings became so common that eventually there was a post by the evidently exasperated administrator of the Facebook account as follows. "Any further new posts protesting about people not social distancing will have to be removed. We know it's true, we agree with these sentiments, but there are only so many times it can be said without annoying people. Phone the guards or talk to the people that you see breaking the rules, but posting here is not going to make a difference." There were also occasional opposition postings, as in, "Looking forward to reading the rants about teenagers today. I'm sure the affluent middle-class internet mob will be out in force, the most vocal of whom will be stopping each other to give out while on their family walks around the town." Now, in a way, none of this was really a surprise. I mean, my ethnography was with the retired people of Cuan, and I found that the most common prior occupations in this area was probably, civil service, health, education. So people here kind of naturally align themselves with the responsibilities of the state. Indeed, in July, Ireland may well have become the country that had the most and the fastest downloads of a smartphone track and trace app of pretty much any country, at least where it wasn't, there wasn't any enforcement behind downloading. Within 2 days, there were 1 million downloads, which is about a quarter of the eligible population of Ireland. Now, the meme you can see here, I think suggests that people really rather enjoyed the opportunity to take on this role as citizen police. It confirmed the self-belief in their own moral stance, and as suggested here, it could also be quite fun. Indeed, there's an infamous novel that sort of pilloried this tendency in our society to exercising normative control through one's neighbours, often through gossip, which was called The Valley of the Squinting Windows. This next meme was from the Cohen Facebook, but it looks to me like it was sourced in the UK. And I want to turn for a moment to the situation in the UK. The meme's an example of a wider genre that included, for example, a popular version that has the police breaking up Da Vinci's Last Supper. Within the UK, these memes speak to an important event in the initial police intervention. This was when a local council used to harass 2 hill walkers. Now, although people were supposed to remain at home or only walk nearby, it was obvious that these hill walkers were extremely socially isolated and a danger neither to themselves or anyone else. So although the police were working in accordance with the law, many people felt it was the police that were kind of in the wrong. A consistent thread through this discussion, I think highlighted by the meme, is clearly people's perception of the role of fairness in civil society. As in examples in New Orleans, Argentina, or Brazil, social media exposed debates not so much about whether something is legal or illegal, but whether the action is deemed by the public as fair or not fair. Now, the climax to this issue in the UK was the, not surprisingly, already mentioned Dominic Cummings debacle, when the individual, often seen as the puppet master of the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, not only broke social isolation regulations, but came up with some amazingly lame excuses, including the idea that he had to go to the local tourist town to check his eyesight, drive there. So the outrage over the way he was defended by the Prime Minister centred on fairness, the implication that there was one law for the powerful and one for everyone else. And indeed, a recent study that was published a couple of weeks ago in The Lancet showed how this single event impacted upon compliance with restrictions in the UK. But fairness is something that is often determined at a very local level, which leads to my final vindication of anthropology. What would make track and trace succeed in the UK? It turns out that ultimately it's probably not what has been the controversy almost up to now, which was deciding between a state and centralized approach to the smartphone app, or what now seems to be coming into being, which is a collaboration with commercial forces, including Apple and Google, important though that may be. But really what the last few weeks have shown is that it's only when the state has kind of relinquished control and started to trust local communities and local people to carry out track and trace that finally in the UK we may have some sort of track and trace that may actually work, at least better than it did before. Which once again conforms, I would suggest, to a key conclusion of many anthropological studies, including our own current ASA project on smartphones and smart aging. Our whole approach to this topic is based on what we call smart from below. It's what people...
Okay to make your conclusions now, Danny. Thanks.
It's what people do in response to its potential that makes the smartphone smart. In this case, becoming the basis of often a local normative order. Of course, that's typically a contested space. There will be vaccine refuseniks. But as this paper has shown, once some consensus is reached, then local populations can become quite assiduous as the good citizens of COVID-19 in enforcing any new normativity around the actions of both states and individuals. So to conclude, in all 4 areas discussed in this, and I think also in the longer paper, the events of COVID-19 have thereby shown just how much anthropology could contribute to global problems through local solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Wonderful. What a great paper. Please do put your questions into the chat box or a comment if you want to make a comment. We'll move quite swiftly on to Git, if that's okay. Over to you, Git.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Here we go. Thank you for inviting me as well on this day with some fascinating papers that we've heard already. Different tack here, going back to India. We had a paper on India earlier, and I very much have to say that this is a paper based on co-researched work and co-written work with Grace Carswell, Nidhi Subramaniam, and Yuvraj. And we are interested here, or we're presenting some data, preliminary data very much, on our research on the impact of the lockdown on rural livelihoods in South India. And I very much say the lockdown because these are 2 villages in which we've done research where so far, to our knowledge, nobody has actually contracted the virus yet. So it's not the direct impact of a pandemic, but much more of the lockdown that was imposed on the 21st of March. We are particularly interested in understanding forms of patronage and care that were available to different sections of the rural labouring classes, the rural working population. And our focus are 2 villages which we've called Alapuram and Manapalayam in middle of Tamil Nadu in the hinterland of the city of Tirupur. And Tirupur is a major garment export and producing hub. And so the villages in the area around this city are very much reliant on garment work for their livelihoods. We've done ongoing research in this place since 2008. Since 2019, July, we had a 1-year ongoing project there as well. Now, once the lockdown was imposed on the 25th of March, we immediately switched to phone interviews. We conducted since then over 70 phone conversations with local villagers and 15 phone conversations with migrant workers. And they were done in Tamil by Yuvraj and in Hindi by Nidhi. So very quickly, who are the people living in these places? To sketch it very generally, in Alapuram, people rely on garment work, in Tirupur or in small garment units that have mushroomed in the village itself. The Gaunders are a caste of landowners, very much an owning class, and the labouring classes consist of 2 groups of Dalits, Adi Dravidas, and an even lower ranking Aundadias. In Manapalayam, very few people from here go and work in the city because in the village itself, power looms have been set up by the landowners again. And people find work or have been employed in these power looms. The labouring classes here consist of 3 main groups: local Dalits, some of them also migrants who've settled here, some intermediate castes, both local and migrants, because this village has attracted lots of people because of the work available. And then, importantly, over the last 10 years or so, North Indian migrants, particularly from Bihar and UP, have been attracted to these villages to be employed in a particular section of the power loom industry, for which the local Gaunders no longer want to recruit local labour. Now, what was the immediate impacts of the lockdown? Well, almost all work and income ceased overnight. In Tirupur and in the villages also, garment workers lost their jobs as factories closed, and many people hadn't even received the last week's wages. In the power loom workers in Manapalayam, they lost their works, the power looms closed down, and the last wages were paid on Saturday, the 21st of March, just a few days before the lockdown. But here, as I will explain in a moment, workers did receive further cash advances from their employers. And the North Indian migrants were without work, but they were very much stuck in the dormitories provided by employers where they used to live. But they were also unable, in the initial stages at least, to return home, and they often had several months of wages still outstanding that had not been paid to them yet, often as far back as January. So in the weeks that followed then, agriculture gained a new significance, as it was the only sector where work and some sort of income was still available. Now, interestingly to us, we found that everyone reported that the women of the village, particularly the mothers and the wives of those who otherwise would work in the power looms or in the garment factories, became the sole earners, the main providers for the household, as they still worked in agriculture and they still brought an income home. So they were the ones who were combining both reproductive and productive care to the households. But agriculture was unevenly accessible. Some women who'd always worked for one landowner would have better relationships and get more work than others. And after some time, cultivation also started slowing down. So who did people turn for care apart from the family? Well, they also turned to the state for care. From April onwards, the state started distributing free food rations under the PDS, which is the public distribution system, to local households. But there's two caveats here. On the one hand, this was often very much inadequate to feed a family for a whole month. This money didn't suffice really. And also not everyone was included in this. Many people were left out of state provision of food. Local migrants from within the state who were not registered in the village were left out. Some people were not registered under the new PDS, which was digitized over the last couple of years, and long-distance migrants, interstate migrants were completely left out of any provision. In terms of NREGA, some of you might be familiar with that. That is a local national rural employment scheme. It's a public work scheme for money, was completely dysfunctional at this time. From late March till late May, early June in the second village, this didn't work at a time that it actually could have been most helpful. It could have helped most of particularly elderly people also who work on NREGA, could have at least provided them with some basic income. And even many of those workers had outstanding wages still from as far back as January that had not been paid. And then, of course, alcohol shops reopened later on in the course of May, I believe it was. And when that opened, there was a whole controversy about this. As one man said, this government uses the police department to protect wine shops instead of protecting people. And a lot of police force was used to protect the wine shops rather than the people. And that's, of course, reminiscent of discussions we have here in the UK about the reopening of the pubs. So who then did people turn to for patronage and for support when the state could only deliver that much? Well, there was a huge diversity of patterns that we observed. In Alapuram, we have very much a free labor force that goes to work in different garment factories wherever work is available. But that also meant that although labor was free in this village, they also had no links with their employers and therefore no patrons to turn to. Tirupur employers did not maintain bonds with their workers and very quickly switched off their phones as soon as the lockdown set in. The village-based employers similarly might have some bonds with their workers who they'd employed for a bit longer, but very often they only give them very small sums of money and again switched off their phones and often moved to a different village to relatives' houses to stay away from the workers. In Manapalayam, there were two main patterns. The local and the Tamil migrant labor force was very much embedded in relations of labor bondage based on debt, on cash advances given by employers. Now, although here we had a bonded labor force, these workers at least in some ways had a patron to go to and to appeal to for support. And they received some cash help from their employers who were keen to hang on to these workers. Once the industry was to start up again, they'd be very keen to have them on the shop floor very quickly again. However, these cash advances were added to their outstanding debts. And these debts were therefore ever mounting, putting people ever further into debt and into bondage. However, in Manapalayam, also a communal kitchen was started up. And this communal kitchen was started up with the help, both in kind and cash, from the Gounders and the power loom owners who were, contributing over a 2-week period to keep the labor force of the community fed. Now, the other labor force in Manapalayam are the North Indian migrants. Now, the North Indian migrants were kept in accommodation, often not allowed to go even to, the next door village or to even the local shop. And their wages were often withheld, so they had no cash at all. The only cash they were given was cash for food, to buy food, basically to keep themselves alive. But that food, that cash then rather, was again deducted from the wages that the employer still owed them. And it was also tied to new forms of exploitation, as many of these workers, or several at least reported to us, were also made to work and to do unpaid work for their employers during the lockdown. So no surprise, many of them sought to return home, and in a minute I'll say something more about them. So what do the post-lockdown futures look like for these populations amidst the ongoing uncertainty and the ongoing partial lockdown that exists? Because in Tirupur, where people would go back to work, there are still high levels of the pandemic and high levels of cases occurring every day. So from June onwards, there was a gradual return to work, but work was very irregular, often only half days, and often very unpredictable. People would have 1 week of work, and then the next week again, employers couldn't give them anything. There were reported wage cuts across all sectors. New recruits were given lower wages. Women in agriculture said where they used to earn 400 rupees a day, they would get 350 rupees a day. And people in companies saw wages slashed with often up to 60%. Moneylenders very quickly started to ask for the loan repayments, and people who went back to work said that their initial wages all went to the repayment of loans rather than anything else. Agricultural work started dwindling during the dry season, but women often remained the main earners of the household, even as men started working as well. And Rega work restarted, but it failed to meet the demand, and older people often reported being excluded. Now, what happened to the North Indian migrants? Because their story really was the most harrowing of all. By May, most migrants started trying to make their way back home. Some got onto the Shamik trains that the government had put on. They got no help from employers at all, and they often still kept withholding wages, saying, we'll pay you wages when you reach back home, and others said, we'll pay you wages once you return back to Tamil Nadu. What happened then was that their families back home in Bihar and UP started sending money to finance the return journeys of their sons. So the care really came from home. And young men in Tamil Nadu started putting money together to hire buses on which they made their way back to Bihar and UP. That increased their indebtedness of their families back at home, and migrant households were therefore sustained again by the labor often of parents, either on their farm or waged labor. So the care very much came from home. Employers in Tamil Nadu promised to settle their wages once they returned to Tamil Nadu, but that was largely really a means to tempt them back to Tamil Nadu and entrench their exploitation. So they became in a way bonded by withheld wages, by not having wages paid and therefore being lured back to Tamil Nadu. So a combination of indebtedness, joblessness back at home, and wages that they were due led many of them to contemplate returning to Tamil Nadu. And by the time we interviewed the North Indian migrants in Tamil Nadu in the middle of July, several of them were already back in Tamil Nadu. So to conclude, what does this tell us all about the ways in which we can rethink patronage and forms of care? Well, there has been a lot written about there being a linear transition in India, and transition from all the forms of permanent labor bondage to new forms of bondage, with much less patronage attached. People have written that, various scholars have written that neo-bondage forms are more time-bound, temporal, seasonal, less personal, and involve more migrants, and therefore they can't really make long-term claims of patronage on their employers. But what our data seems to point to is that there's actually a diversity of dependency relationships, and therefore also a diversity of degrees of patronage extended to workers. So our garment workers, they were free, not dependent, but they also had no patrons to turn to. Powerloom workers were permanently bonded, and actually they were the ones who received most and longest, for the longest period of time, some research from their employers. And the interstate migrants were most vulnerable, most exploitable, and they received also the most limited support. In terms of care, we found that most care actually came from the household itself. Mothers and wives providing for households in Tamil Nadu, and parents back home providing for the return of the migrants to their home villages. And that allows us then to say much more about the way in which the productive and the reproductive economy is interconnected, but also at the same time spatially divided. My last slide, a few very final reflections on what it is, what's happening when we do ethnographic research during a pandemic. But on the one hand, virtual online research methods, and in our case using phones, became a particularly valuable resource where face-to-face research became suddenly impossible. And we were very keen to document what was happening in these villages that we were in the middle of doing research in. But there's a lot of caveats to be added. We were in the middle of a project. We had a trust of people, we had connections, we had their phone numbers, we had a lot to build on. Many people who were at the start of the project, faced many more serious issues to be able to continue their projects. And there's a lot of biases and limitations in built as well in phone interviews. There is issues of connectivity, and phone ownership is heavily biased by gender, age, and class. We found that women and older people had many fewer phones than younger men, for example, but their phones were also often the first ones to be switched off when the family ran out of money. And so a lot of biases meant that we couldn't just reach everyone in the village in an equal way. And finally, ethics becomes a much more challenging field as well. How do we assess the safety and the needs of informants? How do we assess whether and how to approach vulnerable and very anxious research participants? We received additional ethical approval to these phone conversations, but we were still left with the question whether that really helped us address the real ethical challenges that we encountered in the phone conversations. On balance, we felt that it was important to document particularly the voices of the most vulnerable workers here, and hence we did go ahead with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kit. That was another fabulous paper. Please, as always, put your questions and comments into the chat box and we'll get to them at the end. We'll now move on to Heike. Handing over to you, Heike. Thanks.
You're muted. Just unmute yourself, Heike.
Yes, no, sorry. Thank you for having me in this very interesting panel. I'll go down to it because my paper is rather, there's a lot to talk about. My paper is about a different kind of pandemic, the pandemic of precarity, which kind of was revealed by the COVID pandemic. And I think, like like most of you, like pretty much everybody, I was following in the early days many of the debates and webinars and blogs and so on how COVID was evolving, and I was doing so from Argentina, where I'm currently in quarantine. Well, like everybody here in Argentina. But what struck me about the debates was that the focus, and I suppose this is to a significant extent what this panel is addressing, the focus in many of these debates, particularly in the early couple of months, the first couple of months of the pandemic, were very not just focused on Europe and to some extent Eurocentric, but also they reflected very much the class background of the contributors. The issues were around home working from home, anxieties in relationship to how social distancing would affect social life, the freedom to travel, and so on and so forth. However, much of that did not really immediately, to some extent, clashed with what I was observing in Argentina. The challenges there that were faced by the lockdown were of quite a different nature. And I think that's not just in Argentina the case, but also in a number of countries in the global south, where, including very basic World Health Organization guidelines, were not only difficult to implement, but actually were quite unrealistic. Just to put this in context, in the first 2 months of this year, so that was before the pandemic and the quarantine hit in Argentina or in Latin America, 25 Wichita children had perished due not to COVID-19, which wasn't there yet, but due to malnutrition and dehydration. And the dehydration aspect is of course very important because it highlights a difficulty of accessing water. And that, to begin with, would make frequent hand washing very difficult. But it's not just in rural areas where that was an issue. It became very quickly clear that this would be an issue in many of the very populous areas of Buenos Aires, of the Buenos Aires province surrounding the capital, of the shanty towns and so on, where you often have something like 20 families sharing access to the same water tap, living in very crowded conditions and so on. The government, or the health advisors to the government here, I mean, it has to be said, it has to be recognized, the government has been trying to prioritize health over the economy, something that cannot be said for many of the other leading economies. But it coined the term communal quarantine when it was when it became clear that it was too much of a challenge to impose a quarantine on people who tried to survive and besides who could not stay at home in their homes. It was quickly clear that it was easier to stay at home at some homes and not so much in other homes. So they devised a concept of communal quarantine, which meant that they locked in the entire community and entire neighborhood, where they then attempted to do a very close tracking of the infections and so on and so forth. However, this raised, of course, well, it was a measure of necessity, but it does also raise another issue, and that is it highlights the rift and the growing rift between the rich and poor in Argentina. Because the first cases that came to, that were identified with COVID-19 were cases who traveled from abroad, from Italy, from countries where the infection rate was rising. These are not your ordinary Argentinian working class people. These are people of certain means, economic means, that therefore brought the disease to some extent to the country. It is then quite interesting. There was a report done at the end of March by over 500 Argentine researchers and staff of the universities and academic institutions, which was sort of fieldwork based, and about the conditions, the responses to the first 2 weeks of quarantine in Argentina. And it was very interesting that in that report, people were identifying COVID-19 as a disease of the rich, the disease of the wealthy, or in some cases, that's from different parts of the country, or in some cases as in case of a Guarani group, or indigenous Guarani group, as a disease of the white people, which adds a racialization to that class divide. So that was certainly one of the problems with the communal quarantines. I will get back a little bit later to that report. As the death toll rose sharply across Europe and borders closed, the modern Western's world sense of security, ability to plan ahead, and the value of their lives was profoundly shaken by these events. this modern Western world sense articulates, I argue, middle class, not working or minority group sensibilities, whose lives prior to the pandemic were characterized by an incongruity between the hegemonic sense of security and their own lived experiences of more precarious lives. The eruption of the Black Lives Matter movement in the midst of the pandemic, I don't think is somehow unexpected in that sense. It is the clearest expression yet of that dissonance in the global North. The deadly violence and harassment Black people, and I use this as a political term here, experience is not new, and neither are occasional reactions to racism, protests, clashes, and so on. However, the birth of such a sustained movement, it has been going on now for several weeks, that grew on both sides of the Atlantic and will likely have far-reaching repercussions in other parts of the world, including Latin America, is, I suggest, the consequence of how this pandemic reveals these contradictions and ills that lie at the heart of neoliberal capitalism and capitalism more generally. In Argentina, of course, this kind of situation is made worse by the fact that the emergency laws that the government had produced are squarely ignored by the companies. For example, the emergency law supposedly prohibits redundancies during the pandemic, yet a holding like Techint, which is Argentina's most important oil conglomerate, made overnight 1,450 workers redundant, despite this prohibition. Now, this is only the clearest case of a string of redundancies that have been happening despite the law prohibiting this. So the situation is quite difficult for people, but it also shows something else. On the other hand, Latour, for example, seems to suggest, and various others already echoes a belief that the pandemic brought the world to a halt, the world economy to a halt. Well, the reality, I think, is quite different. The National Daily Clarín, for example, in the midst of the quarantine, reported a breakthrough record, a number of flights by American Airlines between Argentina and the United States, and carrying 411 tons of soy seeds to the United States. So certain economic exchanges have not stopped due to the pandemic. It slowed others down, but there are winners and losers, so to speak. One other area, so let me go on. Let me quickly do a short timeline of the Argentine pandemic and how it started. On 3rd of March, the first case was reported in Argentina, as I said, by somebody returning from Italy. On 12th of March, the government announced that from 17th of March, all international flights would be cancelled for 30 days, and they are still cancelled as of today, with the exception of Argentine Airlines for repatriating its citizens. On the 20th of March, 128 confirmed COVID cases, and 3 of whom had died as a consequence of the disease. A full quarantine was declared to be revisited fortnightly. At that stage, all cases were traced, or all identified cases were traced and linked to people who had returned from travel abroad or were in direct contact with them. On 26th of March, the government sanctioned the decree of executive need and urgency, which is what I've already mentioned. Because of one of the things that you could see on the streets was one sector of worker as vehicles stopped, cars stopped, traffic stopped. One sector of workers appeared on these streets, and these were the repartidores, the couriers, the delivery workers, who were also declared an essential worker. I decided to take heed from that report that I had mentioned, done by Argentine academics, who carried out fieldwork using WhatsApp. Basically, they used their existing contacts in fieldwork, contacted them in order to ask them the questions and carry out the fieldwork. So I tried to do the same thing, but it was a bit more challenging in my case. I was using my existing fieldwork contacts in political organizations of the left and in the Workers' Recovered movement, with whom I had worked for many years. And but I had no direct contacts with the repartidores. So I managed to access it eventually through the back doors, but that means I had to establish, like what some other people have said, the question of establishing trust and so on and so forth. I tried to use the video communications via WhatsApp, and in some other cases, Duo or whatever, that in fact an interviewee suggested to me, and that sort of worked, minus a few technical challenges and in internet disruptions, but it did work, because at least you did have a face-to-face interaction, albeit via video. I did a number of interviews, basically all in July. I also attended a couple of protests that the repartidores started to organize, as well as some assembly meetings and some some online Zoom assembly meetings. What I found interesting is when I was talking to my contacts, for example, they invited me around to see them working in the factory. And I declined. I said, look, I think it is better we talk via WhatsApp, for the simple reason that I could not justify it ethically to put people at risk, to put them at risk or whatnot.
Heike, could you move to your conclusions, please?
Oh, already, okay.
Thank you.
Basically, the repartidores face a difficult challenge, and that is that the companies, the platforms, the digital platforms, claim that they are not workers. They deny them the status as a worker, yet they are essential workers. This is basically the ways in which digital platforms reduce costs associated with coordination and transaction profoundly changes value change, the management of organization, and the work towards patterns that are called platformization of companies and work. We have to understand that they are viewed to be collaborators and not workers, and they claim that because they are new type of organization. However, the way repartidores are treated and work is quite staggering. Many of them work 9-12 hours on a bicycle. The algorithms that are used are often used to increase their productivity, leading to putting their lives at risk, because they are tied to mobile phones while on the road, trying to find out where next they have to go, which they are not told in advance. And they are encouraged to get there fast as possible, or they will be paused, or they will, and they move down the point scales that are put in place to ensure their work. And it is this which has produced an unusual situation in Argentina, where repartidores have already organized 4 different strikes. They are not unionized, minus a couple of hundred of them who were unionized still when the first digital platforms arrived here in late 2015, and they since have started to make people redundant and re-employ them basically on this much more precarious side. So what the main point is of, I wanted to show you some pictures, but I think I've not got time for this. Let me see, where am I?
Can we, we're going to have to leave it there, Heike, if that's all right. I'm sorry to keep interrupting you. There's just 4 minutes left of the session before we go to break.
Is that, do I still have 4 minutes or not?
No, not really. Do you want to make a conclusive remark?
Yes. Basically, what is important to note here is that the precarity is a matter that the platform-related precarity is something that is emerging, and it is capitalist paradise, because from the capitalist point of view, they can diminish their responsibility towards the workers. They are not making themselves responsible for the equipment. They're not making themselves responsible as employers, and so on and so forth. And it is something, including, that we will be facing increasingly in higher education. There was a video that I saw, I mean, where the platforms are beginning to organize themselves and present themselves as a democratic, new progressive alternatives, reaching into all areas. I'm leaving at this.
Sorry, I'm going to have to stop you.
Yes. Okay.
Sorry, we literally have 2 minutes left before we have to close the session completely. Sorry to keep interrupting you.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you to all of our speakers. What wonderful papers. Really, to me, I only have a couple of minutes, so I'm just going to briefly sum up how I see these interconnecting, and we can move on to the questions as individual authors, I think. So for this panel, really looking at examining a pandemic in an age of neoliberal capitalism, really all come out of all 3 of these papers, and really showing such enormous global inequalities, very well presented in case studies from India and Argentina. And this is summed up to me by the quote that you provided, Danny, when you opened your talk, the neoliberal cult of privacy. That to me sums up everything that has been presented to us today in this session. So perhaps that's something that we can discuss at the end of the final session, or something that people might want to discuss in the chat as we move on to session 3. Okay. So that brings us to the end of this session. Again, thank you so much to our 3 presenters. On behalf of your other authors, Geert, I know there are a number of authors for your paper, and other researchers for you, Danny. We can't clap, but we're all clapping in silence. To everyone else, we now have a half-an-hour break, and then we come back at 2:30 for the final session on methodological consequences at 2:30 till 3:30. And there should be time within that session to have further discussions. And hopefully some of our authors will have a chance to answer your questions in the chat between now and then. So have a nice break, everyone, and thank you again to our speakers.